everyone, welcome to Tutorials by Decade. My name is Decade, and in this video we are going to work on loot tables. So in the previous video we had our coin. So we are going to use this coin right here as our loot, and then we're going to make our loot table expandable, so as we add items we can add them to the loot table. So now that that is out of the way, let's get this out of the way. If you have not already subscribed, please do so, as I have videos like this coming out all the time and I don't want you to miss anything. Also, if you've seen any of my other videos, go ahead and give this one a thumbs up right now. Both of those things help me out, and I do appreciate it. It keeps me motivated to keep making these videos. So please, 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 and thank you. And now that that's out of the way, we can get to work. So in order to make our loot table, what we're going to do is we are going to go into our scripts. We'll go into items, and then we'll right click, we'll go to create, and we will make a mono behavior script, and we will name this one simply loot table. All right, and then we'll open that up. Sorry if there's any background noise. My kid's trying to cook for the first time. So if you hear me yell and scream, yeah, then we know it's not going well. Anyway, so what we're going to do at the top here, let me adjust my mic because that's not very comfortable. We are going to do using system.collections.generic. And that's going to be grayed out for right now, but that'll change here shortly. And then above public class loot table, we are going to create asset menu, and we're going to name that one menu name, then action RPG loot, and then loot table. And then what we're going to do is mono behavior script here. We are going to get rid of that and make this a scriptable object. Once we do all that, we can get rid of all this. And then what we want to do is we want to make this system.serializable. And then we're going to do a public class loot entry. And in here, we're going to do just a tooltip. And then we're going to name this prefab to spawn. So like this will be a coin, an arrow, health, or so on. And then we're just going to make this a public game object. And then we'll call it drop prefab. Then we'll do another tooltip. And we'll make this one the relative weight. And when I say weight, I don't mean like physical weight. Like we're not going to have a weight system where the character can only carry so much. I mean weight as in, the chance of it being dropped. So the higher this number, the more common the drop is going to be. Then we'll make it a minimum of 0f. And then we'll do a public float weight, and we'll default it to 1f, but we're going to be able to change that. Now we need to do a tooltip minimum number of this item to spawn if selected. And we're going to do another minimum here, and we're going to do 1. Then we're going to do a public int min quantity and make that 1. Then we'll do another tooltip. And then we'll do maximum number of this item to spawn if selected. We'll also make this minimum of 1, and then we'll do public int max quantity equals 1. And then the last thing we're going to do here is another tooltip. And we'll do if true spawn quantity as separate pickup. Usually better for things like coins. And then we'll do a public bowl spawn individually. Then we'll default that to true. So this is going to be each individual item that we are going to have in our loot table. And I will explain how a serializable scriptable object works once we get to that point. But for now, we need to finish the rest of our loot table. So down here, what we're going to do is we're going to put a header, and we're going to do drop behavior. And then our tooltip here will be how many times to roll on this table. So we're going to set it up where there's going to be a chance to roll more times, meaning a chance for more loot. So if we default this to 1, that means a single drop. 2 equals 2 chances for a drop, and so on. Now I know if we're trying to make an exact game like Legend of Zelda, then it's only 1 drop per. But just in case you want to have a chance at multiple drops. So we are going to do minimum of 1. And then we're going to do public int rolls equals 1. And then another tooltip, chance 0 to 1 that a roll returns nothing. So we're adding a chance for nothing to drop. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do range 0f and then 1f. And then we're going to do a public float chance to drop nothing. We're going to default that to 0.25f, and we'll be able to change that later. And then lastly, we want a header here, and then loot entries. And then tooltip, the actual loot that has a potential to drop. And what we're going to do is make a public list of loot entry. And we'll name it entries. And that's going to equal a new list of loot entries. All right. So now, crazy dog. Anyway, for now, we are going to make a summary here. And that summary is going to say returns a random entry based on weights, or null if nothing should drop. And we're going to do a public loot entry roll once. And make sure that you don't have those 3 slashes in there. All right, so we're going to do a couple checks here. So if entries equals null, or if entries.count equals 0. So in other words, if we don't have entries for whatever reason, or we do, but for whatever reason that entries count is 0, then we're just going to return null, meaning we're not going to do anything. Then we're going to check if the no drop chance won out, and if that did, what we're going to do is a random value. And if that random value is less than the chance to drop nothing, then we're going to also return null and not do anything. So this chance to drop, it's between 0 and 1f, which means 0 for 0% chance, 1 for 100% chance. So anything in between there will trigger this. So if it has a random value of, say, 0.2, and our chance to drop is at 0.25, then that means we hit that chance to drop and we're not going to drop anything. If we make it past those two things, then what we're going to do is float total weight equals 0f. And then I don't think we've done a for loop yet, but what a for loop does is it goes through an entire list and it checks for certain things. And I'll explain that as we go here. So for int I equals 0, I less than entries dot count I plus plus. So what we're doing here is we're setting a number, an integer, to 0. And then if that number is less than the count, then we're going to increase that I, but only after we do everything that's in this loop. So we're going to do an if statement here. Entries I equals null, or if entries I, sorry, it's hard to see, my cat's in the way, dot drop prefab equals null. So we're essentially just doing another check to make sure there's actually stuff here. If for whatever reason the first check passed, but there actually isn't anything. So what we're going to do here is continue. And then we're also going to do another check here, entries I dot, that's not what I wanted. I wanted weight is less than or equal to 0f. Then we're also going to continue. And then after that, we're going to do total weight plus equals entries I dot weight. So what we're going to do is that list that we're creating up here, we're going to put items in it. And each of those items is going to have a weight. And what this for loop is going to do is it's going to go through each of those items and get its weight and add it all together to the total weight. And the total weight's going to come into play a little bit later. If you want the chances to actually be like, say, 25% or whatever, you want your total weights to equal 100. Now, bear in mind, that is not including the total chance to drop nothing. So you're going to have to do a little bit of math if you want to get like the actual chance to drop, this or that or whatever. All right, so again, this for loop that I have highlighted here, this is just to get the weights. So after we get the weights, I got confused by my own notes here. There we go. So after we get the weights, we're going to check the total weight. And if the total weight is less than or equal to 0f, then we're going to return null, meaning we're going to return nothing and it's not going to drop anything. Now, we're only putting this in here as just a check in case we mess up in the inspector in Unity. But if we do everything right, the total weight should never equal 0. Now we get past all that, then we're going to do float roll equals random value times total weight. Then we're going to do float running equals 0f. And then we're going to do another for loop here. So for int I equals 0, I less than entries dot count, and then I plus plus. By the way, this right here is the standard for a for loop. Now you can change I to a different number or a different letter, especially if you have multiple for loops within a loop, or if for whatever strange reason it makes more sense to make this a different letter, which I'll explain in the next script that we work on. But for now, this is the standard of how you do a for loop. But anyway, in the for loop, we're going to do variable e equals entries. And I already figured out what I wanted there, so there we go. Then we're going to do an if statement. So if e equals null, meaning for whatever reason, there is no entry, or if e dot drop prefab equals null. And again, it shouldn't for whatever reason. But if it does, we're just going to continue. And then if e dot weight is less than or equal to 0f, which again, it shouldn't, but we're just covering our butts here. We're going to continue. And now we're actually going to do running plus equals e weight. And then if rule is less than or equal to running, then we're going to return e. And then lastly, what we're going to do down here is just return null. And we're going to save that. So what this for loop is doing is we are figuring out what items we actually have and the weight of all those items. All right. And then we're going to roll a random number. So the running up here is going to equal the weight. And the roll is going to be a random value times the total weight. So if the random value is, say, 0.25 and the total weight is 100, essentially that means we're going to do 25. And if 25 is less than the weight of that item, then our chance of dropping that item is good, which means we're likely going to drop that item. So that is it for loot table. So now what we need to do is we need to go back into Unity, let all this compile. While that's compiling, I'm going to pull up my notes for the next one. There we go. So now that we have the loot table, we're going to right-click, create mono behavior script, and we are going to create the loot dropper. So this is what's actually going to drop the loot once we figure out what to drop. So let Unity do its thing here, and then we're going to load this up, get rid of all this fun stuff, and let's get to work. So we're going to do a header, and we'll call it loot settings. And then in here, we're going to serialize the field, and we're going to do a private loot table, And here we're going to do another tooltip, and we're going to do optional override spawn point, like a chest, mouth, or enemy center. So what we're going to do is serialize field. We're not going to hide it in inspector. I don't know why it wants that to pop up there, but we're going to do a private transform drop point. So what we're doing here is we're creating a drop point where you want the item to drop whenever the loot says you should be getting this item. Now the reason why we're not just spawning it right on top of the enemy, the chest, the pot, or whatever, is because if you want a certain thing to drop, say, in the middle of the screen or in a certain area after you defeat like a boss or something, that is why we're doing this. Now the easiest fix to make it drop on an enemy or something, I'll show you once we get done with this script and we get into Unity. But that's the whole reason why we're overriding the spawn point. All right. Then what we're going to do is a header scatter. And then this will be the random offset radius for drops, which prevents stacking on one pixel. So if you do have more than one drop, it'll scatter those drops as opposed to just having them all stack up. So like if you have, say, 2 coins that are supposed to drop, instead of having those coins stack up on top of each other, in which case the player won't know there's actually 2 coins, you can have them scatter so that way it actually looks like 2 coins. So we're going to serialize that field, and then we're going to do a private float scatter radius. And for now, we're going to default that to 0.25. And then 0.25f. And then lastly, we need a private bool has dropped. Then equals false. Now, one thing some people have asked me, like, why do you serialize certain fields and then don't serialize, like, say, that? Well, anything that you're going to want to have control over, you want to serialize so that way it shows up in the inspector. So, like, let's just say that scatter radius here isn't enough. Well, instead of going back into the code and manually changing the numbers in the code and then saving it and then all that stuff, we can control it in the inspector so we don't have to keep jumping back and forth between, the scripts and Unity. Whereas something like the private bool has dropped, there shouldn't be any reason why we need to manually change this in Unity. There is a debug mode in Unity where you can see anything that's private, even if it's not serialized, to see if like maybe this is triggering or not triggering if certain events are happening. But you don't necessarily want to flood your inspector with every single private bool, float, or whatever variable you're using. So you should technically only be serializing the things that you actually need to manually add or things that you should be manually changing without having to go back into scripts. But with all of that, let's move on. What we're going to do is a public void drop. And this is where we're actually going to drop the loot. And that's why I'm making this public, because the other scripts that are going to need to access this, it needs to be obviously public. So we're going to do a check first. If has dropped, then we're just going to simply return and not do anything because something is already dropped and we should not drop double loot. We're going to do one more check here. If loot table is null, then we're also going to return and not do anything. If we make it past those checks, then what we're going to do is we're going to change has dropped to true, so that way we don't accidentally drop things multiple times. We're going to set a vector 3 origin, and it's going to equal drop point, and we're going to check to see if it's null. If it is not null, then the drop point dot position is where we want to drop it. If it is null, then we want to drop it at the spawn point, i.e. the enemy or the pot or whatever. And it shouldn't be vector 3.0. I shouldn't listen to that thing when it tries to do that. It should be just transform dot position. There we go. So again, what we're doing here with this line of code is we're checking if the drop point is null, meaning we didn't put anything in the drop point. If we didn't, then we're going to do the transform dot position, which means we're going to spawn it right on the enemy, or right on the pot, or right on the chest, or whatever. And if it is, if we did put something in here, then we're just going to drop it wherever we put that point at. And now we're going to do another for loop. So for int r. Now, why am I doing r? Well, that is because... Actually, why did I do r in there? I didn't do two... Oh, I do have another for loop within a for loop. So I did int r equals 0, r less than loot table dot roles, and then r plus plus. And then inside this loot table, we are going to do a variable entry, and that's going to equal loot table dot roll once. I keep putting two O's for roll for whatever reason. Anyway, now that that's there, we're going to check if entry equals null, which it shouldn't. But again, it's always good to put safeties in. We're just going to continue. Our int is going to equal qty, so quantity. And that's going to equal random dot range. And that range is going to be entry dot minimum quantity, and then entry dot max quantity. Then we're going to do if entry dot spawn individually. Then for every I, so yeah, for every quantity, I should say. So we're setting up this little for loop for that. Then we are going to spawn. Now this is going to probably try to auto put spawn point in, fix that to just spawn. But entry dot drop prefab, and then origin. And if it's not spawned individually, we're going to put else. And then in here, you can make stacking pickups where you can have a stack and set its amount equal to the quantity there. But for now, we're just going to do simple, maybe, spawn, and then entry dot drop prefab, and then origin. All right. So now we have these errors for spawn. So let us fix those. And what we're going to do is we're going to come down here and we're going to do a private void spawn. And then it's going to require a game object, which we'll name prefab, and then a vector3, which we'll name origin. Then all we need to do here is a vector2 offset, which equals random dot inside unit circle, and multiply that by the scatter radius. And then we actually need to spawn the items. So instantiate prefab origin plus vector3 offset quaternion dot identity. So this is what's actually going to spawn in the items. And all this fun stuff is going to be actually just dropping the items and figuring out where to drop them. So once the loot dropper is done, there is a couple things that we need to do in order for this to work with some other scripts. So we need to go to breakable object, and we need to go to base enemy. And again, if you don't see those up here, there's this little drop down. You click on that. We'll go to our base enemy first. So let me pull up my base enemy on my other notes here. I'm pretty sure I know what I'm doing with this. I can't quite remember where I put it. So there's where I put it. So in our base enemy, if we go to our stats, so at the bottom of stats, we're going to add a tooltip, and we're going to name that the loot table for this enemy. And then we're going to serialize the field, and then we're going to do a private loot dropper, and then we'll just name it loot dropper. And then at the bottom, where we're actually killing the enemy here, so all the way down where we go to protected void, virtual void die. So we have is alive equals false, rb dot linear velocity equals vector 2.0. Right after that, we're going to do loot dropper, and then drop. And we're essentially going to do the exact same thing for the breakable object script. So at the top here, where did I put that? I put it right after this here. So after the bowl can be broken, I put the tooltip here, the loot table for this object. Then I serialized the field, and then I did a private loot dropper, and then where we actually break the object here. So in our coroutine, the IEnumerator break, what we're going to do is after the animation here to break the object, we're then going to do the loot dropper drop. And then that is all we should need to do in our code. And for future, if you make any other like breakable object code scripts or enemy scripts or anything like that, what we just did in breakable objects and base enemy is what you would do to actually get a loot table. So now that's done, we're going to go back into Unity, let Unity do its thing. Now what we want to do is we want to go to our script for our... You know what? No, what we're going to do is we're going to go to Assets. We're going to create a new folder, and in here we're going to put loot tables. And then just to keep things organized, we're going to make another folder. We're going to do objects, and then another folder, enemies. In our object folder, we're going to right click and make a new folder and just name it pot. And then in that pot folder, we're going to right click, go to create, and that action RPG that we made earlier, it's right here. And we already did this with an item for item definition, but we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to do loot and loot table. And then what we do here is we're going to do LT pot basic. So this is our basic loot table for the pot. And you can see in the inspector it changed a little bit. So here's where we change our chance to drop. This is where we change how many rolls we want. And this is where we change our loot entries. So right now we have 0 loot entries, but we want to change that to 1 right now since we have the coin. And if you drop this down, now you'll see all of this. So it's asking for a few things here. Now, for whatever reason, it didn't auto do all of this stuff, but that's fine. So for weight, we're going to do 1, minimum quantity 1, maximum quantity 1. Spawn individually doesn't matter since we're only doing 1. But where it says the drop prefab, we're going to go to our prefab folder, into our items, into our coin. Now you notice that that went away. So how do we prevent that from happening? Well, if we get this back, you see this little lock button right here? If you click on that, now you can move around and do whatever, and this isn't going to change. So we're going to go to our prefab folder. We're going to find our coin. We're going to drag and drop that in there. Now, whenever you're done, you want to make sure you unlock this, or else you're going to get confused as to why you can't pull up other things. And trust me, it happens to all of us. It's happened to me 1,000 times. It will happen to you. Just make sure you check that unlock button, and now you can move around the different things. But we created our loot table, and as you can see, we can add and subtract things from the loot table. So as we add more items, we can adjust this. But we want to go back to enemies in the loot tables. You'll want to create a folder, and we'll name this one blue slime. And in the blue slime, we want to create a loot table as well. So action RPG, loot table, and we'll name this LT underscore blue slime underscore basic. And we're going to do literally the exact same thing. Drag the coin in there, make sure you uncheck that lock. Weight 1, min quality 1, max quantity 1, and we don't need to worry about spawn individually. So that is step 1. Step 2 now means you need to go to your blue slime, and you need to add a component, and we need to add the loot dropper. So if we go to our loot tables here for the blue slime, there it is. We drag and drop that loot table there. The drop point, we can leave blank if we want, or we can drop in a point. For now, we'll leave it blank. There's our scatter radius. But one thing you should notice is our enemy script here. It should have added the loot dropper. So in order to drop that in there, you just grab this loot dropper and drop it there. And then we'll do the same for the breakable pot. We'll add the loot dropper script. We'll make sure we add the pot table. We'll keep that the same, and then the loot dropper, we'll just drop that there. And that should be it. That should be all we need to do. So to verify this works, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit play. And knowing my luck, I'll probably get the chance to get nothing on either one of these, but if we click that, the coin spawned, but because I was standing too close to it, it went away. Let's find our slime enemy. There we go. So there is our spawn, and boom, pick that up. So that is one thing that could be a problem, is if you are standing too close and something spawns. But we'll fix that at a later date. Oh, well, go away. Leave me alone. Boom, there we go. So there's our drop there. Let's see if we get anything here. Yep, so it dropped here. So if you notice that it's dropping too often, if you go to your loot table, there's your chance to drop. You can raise that. So just for fun, we'll raise this to 0.8. So that way there's only a 20% chance to actually drop anything. Ignore my dogs. So we got the coin there. All right, so it dropped there. Let's try this again. I don't want to cheat and make it go all the way to 100% chance to drop nothing, but there we go. So now it dropped absolutely nothing. And since this is at 25%, ooh, look at that. We got nothing on that one too. So the lower this number, the better your chances of something dropping. The higher this number, the lower your chances of something dropping. So this is where the math comes into play. So if we have a 0.25% chance to drop nothing, so instantly that means there's 25% chance to drop nothing, 75% chance to drop something. What drops, though, depends on how many items you have in your loot table. So right now, since it's only one item, it is legitimately a 25-75%. So 25% for nothing, 75% for it to be a coin. But what if we add a second item in here? Well, now there's 25% chance to drop nothing. But instead, we pull up the calculator here. 75 divided by 2. Assuming that they have the same weight, you now have a 37.5% chance of dropping a coin or a 37.5% chance of dropping whatever. But we have the weight. So now the weight comes into play. So if we change the weight of the coin to, say, 75 and the weight of the, say, heart or potion or whatever to regenerate health to 25, that means we now have a 25% chance to drop nothing. But out of that 75% chance, there's a 75% chance that we'll drop a coin and only a 25% chance that we'll drop a health regen item. So, like, I'm not going to do all that math right now, but you can see where all the math comes into play. So you got to keep that in mind when creating your loot tables. But that is how we do loot tables. So this is where I'm going to end this video. If you learned anything from it, if it was helpful, make sure you give it the big old thumbs up. It does help me out. I do appreciate it. If you want to learn more and you haven't already done so, please click on the follow and subscribe button, as I have videos like this coming out all the time, and I don't want you to miss anything. And with all that out of the way, as always, thank you. Have a good one. And I'll see you in the next video.